I met Bosco in the remote wilderness of British Columbia near Mount Robson. At the end of a long rainy day backpacking, I had built a lean-to in a clearing and was preparing to catch my supper in the stream that was nearby. When I looked up, there he was, an enormous black bear, slowly circling the clearing within 30 yards from me. He was not Bosco to me yet, and I was quite alarmed by his presence, as all my food was within easy reach, and I was unarmed. However, I decided to go about my fishing, and the bear came along. Soon he was sitting on his haunches, less than 5 feet away from me, watching, intensely interested in everything that I was doing. When I caught a 14-inch trout, I tossed it to him, and he gulped it down without even bothering to chew. And when I cast out the fly a second time, he moved closer, planting his well-upholstered fanny on the turf right beside me and leaning half of his 500 pounds right against me. When darkness set in, I was still fishing for that bear. I was so fascinated by his gentle manner and his insatiable capacity for eating fish. I began to think of him in a friendly way as Big Bosco, and I didn't mind when he followed me back to camp. I built a fire, cooked my supper, ate it. When I was done, I went and sat on my sleeping bag under the lean-to. All this time, the bear had been sitting on the opposite side of the fire, watching me. But as soon as I settled in on the sleeping bag, he waddled over and sat down right beside me. His wet fur stank, but I rather enjoyed his warmth. And so the two of us sat together, side by side, just listening to the rain thump down on the tarp above us. Then Bosco began licking my hand. Guessing what he wanted, I offered him a handful of salt. Well, he nailed my hand to the ground enthusiastically with his 2-inch long claws that could easily shred all the bark off a cedar tree, claws that could rip open a man's body. But finally, the last grain of salt disappeared, and Bosco stood up on all fours and stepped out into the rainy blackness, letting out a loud, fishy belch as he went. But he was back soon with a message. He sat down right in front of me beside the sleeping bag and turned around, twisting, trying to bite at a spot above his stubby little tail, but he couldn't reach it, and he was growling savagely at the itch. And then he turned around and he nudged me. Then he twisted around again and tried to bite, and then he nudged me again. Finally, I got his message. He wanted me to scratch for him. So I very, very lightly put my hand on his lower back, and he immediately flattened out to a full 7 feet, taking up the entire length of the lean-to. As I put my fingers deep down through his dense, oily fur, I understood why he had been nudging me, for my fingers discovered several engorged ticks embedded in his skin. I twisted it out and thought I was in for a good mauling because his roar shook the forest. But I was determined to finish the job. I took the tick and held it in front of his nose, and he sniffed it, and then I tossed it into the fire. And I continued on twisting those ticks until they were all gone, and then I held my hand in front of his nose to show him they were all gone. And he affectionately and gratefully licked my hand. That night, I was awakened several times by a cold, sniffing nose. As Bosco came and went, he walked around me, he walked over me, every time, leaving my sleeping bag wetter and muddier. The next morning, I was off again, up over a hillside, down through a chilly river, up through another hill, over again, down through some thickets of birch, and then down through a wide river canyon. To my great surprise, Bosco followed along like a faithful dog, digging for grubs every time I stopped to rest. That night, I fished again for Bosco's supper. In the evening, I was sitting on a log, just enjoying my pipe and looking at the view. Bosco had become a faithful companion, and the days had passed quickly. And now he came waddling over to me, and he started to dig at my feet. Guessing that he wanted me to do something for him, I stood up, and he led me over to a dead bee tree. Knowing what he wanted now, I went back to camp, pulled some mosquito netting around my head and tied it tightly, reached for my heavy leather gloves, and grabbed my hatchet. Back at the tree, I lit a smoke fire at the base and hacked away until that dead hollow tree crashed to the earth and split wide open. I received 3 bee stings for my efforts, while Bosco consumed about 20 pounds of honeycomb and consumed hundreds of bees. He snored that entire night at the foot of my sleeping bag. Now, some people ask me why I allowed such a wild, dangerous animal to be so close to me and keep me company. Because I was a sucker for that bear, that's why. I babied Bosco's every whim. If he wanted to be scratched, I scratched. If he wanted to eat fish, I fished. If he wanted to romp and roll through the meadow, I romped and rolled with him, and I still wear the scars till this day. During one particularly rough session, I tackled Bosco's right front leg, bowling him over onto his back. And as I sat triumphantly astride his belly, he retaliated with a left hook that opened up a 2-inch gash down the middle of my chin and sent me spinning across the meadow. When I regained consciousness, I found Bosco standing on all fours over me, licking my wound. His remorse and regret were inconsolable. As I opened my eyes and said, "Bosco," he sat down with his ears flattened and started to bawl like a baby, until finally I managed to sit up and put my arm around his neck and speak softly to him in the bear language that he had taught me. Bosco and I developed a deep affection for each other, which was really brotherly. Whenever it occurred to him, he would stand up on his rear legs, waddle over to me and give me a great smothering bear hug, and let his overflowing emotion express itself in a good face licking. I put up with this behavior for 2 reasons. 1, I was crazy about that bear, and 2, I held a healthy respect for what one swat from that 7-foot-tall giant could accomplish. One afternoon, as we were crossing a meadow, it was studded with several clumps, many clumps actually, of dwarf willows. Suddenly he reared up on his hind legs and let out a loud "Moo!" Oh, I was surprised. I couldn't detect any reason for alarm, but Bosco would not allow me to move forward. He advanced, still erect, snarling, and pandemonium broke loose. Behind every clump of willows sprouted an upright bear. Black bears, brown bears, cinnamon bears, and even one champagne bear. But these were young bears, only 2 years old, and they were no match for Bosco. Bosco charged the closest opponent with the fury of a Sherman tank. He bowled him over and then ran and dislodged a second one, and then a third. And soon the entire meadow was clear of the 2-year-olds. And he came ambling back to me, my champion, my guardian, my friend. And we continued on our journey. That night, we sat longer than usual at the campfire. Bosco kept pawing me, nudging me. He spoke to me at great length, and he looked me long in the eye before he allowed me to retire. He was gone most of the night. By the next afternoon, I sensed that something was wrong because Bosco didn't forage like he usually did. He clung close to my heels. Then, as I was looking across the stream, he suddenly about-faced and galloped up the hill that we had just descended. I didn't call to him as he raced full steam over the crest without once looking back. That night, I cooked my supper with one eye on the hillside, and I lay awake for hours waiting for the familiar nudge. But it never came. By morning, I was desolate. I knew I would never see Big Brother Bosco again, and he left behind memories which I treasure always.